I see it's just about 6:30, so I'm going to go ahead and kick us off. I want to start off by saying welcome to everyone. I love seeing this room packed, and I love seeing people come out and make their voices heard on an issue. For those that I see a lot of yellow sheets of paper. For those that don't have one yet, we do have the surveys here for people to fill out. Jay Grossman behind you all with a couple of the completed surveys. He's going to be our collection point. Find him or find any of the city employees. I'd be more than willing to take a completed survey as well. So we want to make sure that those things get in our hands and make sure they're logged, and so that we can start to tally that information and get it where it needs to go here. So with that being said, let's kick into what we have going on tonight. As I'm sure you all know, tonight's objective is to discuss recreational marijuana in the city of Berkeley. What we're going to try to do tonight is provide you some information about recreational marijuana, about the legislation itself, and what we should be considering as a community before we take any action on this. Represented amongst you tonight as members of the Berkeley City Council. If they wouldn't mind putting their hands up or standing up just a quick moment. So if you have not had the pleasure of meeting your members of council, they are here in mass. Great showing from them tonight, as well as our mayor as well. And so absolutely, they're here to talk to you guys. They're always available, always responsive, and they want to hear from you. Ultimately, it's going to be the action of the city council that sets the policy in place. So make sure to reach out to them as the night goes on. We're going to discuss some of the options available to Berkeley and some of what our potential next steps are, and then also obtain your feedback, which is the whole point of the online survey and the town hall meeting tonight. So it's what we do next greatly depends on the will of the people and on what our representatives want, or what our residents want to see. Those that don't know me, I'm your city manager. I serve. I'm the chief administrative officer for the city. I basically run the day-to-day operations of the city and implement the council's vision and policies. So that starts with me. So I'm going to go through some of the burning questions as well. Represented here today is Mr. Chris Johnson, General Counsel to the Michigan Municipal League. The Michigan Municipal League is based out of Ann Arbor, but they have a heavy presence in Lansing. They interface with they interface with the state's various departments. They interface with the legislature. They're really sort of community's eyes and ears in Lansing. They keep us abreast of what's going on. So Chris is going to kind of offer some of the statewide perspective, as well as run down some of the legal implications of Proposal 1. As I mentioned, the Q&A, please submit those yellow sheets to the staff, and we'll have information stations after the presentation itself. Oh, I'm sorry, thank you. There's also blue cards, so anybody that has questions that they want to see come up tonight, please record them on the blue card. What we like to do with those is we like to get those in writing. If there's something we can't answer tonight, that way we have it in writing so we can get that question answered for the community. Because if you're asking it, chances are in a city of 15,000, there's one or two other people that have the same question you do too. So we like to be very complete in how we give our answers. We like to be very complete in how we respond to the community's inquiries. So after we break out, there'll be information stations. Over here, I'll be talking to some people. Mr. Johnson will be talking to people. As I said, your council members are available. And then also, we've got a couple of dots over there on the city's map. If you do feel like recreational marijuana is appropriate for the city, we'd like to get your thoughts through the dot survey there on what zoning area, what zoning district, what area of the city you would like to see some of these retail facilities go in at. So that'll help us hone in on some of the questions as well. Two burning questions to start out. One I want to answer right off the top of is marijuana with an H or marijuana with a J? Which one is it? Yep. So a little bit of history on marijuana with an H. This is essentially the legal spelling. This is Michigan's chosen spelling based on the act, dating all the way back to 1937. Legal statutes at the federal level, at the state level, they all spell it with an H. That is, again, like I say, the more formal version of this. So in our communications, that's how we've been talking about this as well. Since we're talking about policy, since we're talking about the law, we've been adopting the state spelling of utilizing the H. Much to the chagrin of social media, who thinks we just don't look at our spell checker, it's actually, this is the legal version of it. Now, when it comes to how to change it, per se. That really falls to the Michigan legislature. It's one of the funny flukes of the law is that the legislature somehow controls the spelling of this substance. But as you can see there, we have adopted that only because that's what they use. That's what people voted on. Those that recall voting in November probably saw it spelled with an H when it came to Proposal 1 as well. Burning question number 2, the money part of it, the revenue implications for the city. We've heard a lot of feedback from people saying, you know, how can we pass up this windfall? Communities are going to get so much money. So we want to go through and do a deep dive off the top and start talking about the revenue picture here. So there are going to be, under the legislation, there are going to be 2 types of taxes levied on the sale of marijuana here. There's one, the current sales tax that we already pay on goods and services. That is in place, that's written into the Michigan Constitution. That works just like a piece of bubble gum. When you buy it, you pay your 6 cents on the dollar, and it goes through a formula that's shared by cities and transportation and counties and your local government as well as your state government. If you have more information, I have more information on this over here, but I want to drill down on the new portion, which is the excise tax. So in total, it's 16%. 10% of that is going to be new taxes under the excise. And then we'll receive, it breaks down all the way down to a proportional basis for municipalities. As you see here, it has to be municipalities that allow the licenses to be allocated to your community. So first and foremost, the state is going to be made whole. LARA, or LAURA, is the implementing state agency. They're going to provide the oversight. That's the Licensing and Regulatory Affairs Department. And they're going to have the first cut at the revenues, per se. That was written right into the proposal itself, is that they have to be made whole for their efforts in implementing this law. For the first 2 years, an additional $20 million will come out of this, and it's going to fund clinical studies on suicide prevention in veterans. But that's a limited in scope, and again, limited in time. So for the first 2 years, that amount of money gets taken out before it goes to the next breakout, which is Transportation Fund gets 35%, State School Aid Fund gets 35%, counties and municipalities both get 15%, but that's 15% of those that have the opt-in. So if there is a whole community that doesn't have any license within its borders, it is not going to be included in this. Likewise, if there's a municipality who within its whole borders does not have a licensed facility, then it won't get that money either. So our hypothetical here is, say, across all of Michigan, between growers and dispensers and transportation and retail licenses, say there's about 1,000 licenses. We'll call it a nice, even, clean number. The jury's still out on how many there will actually be across the state, so I'm going to use the hypothetical situation of 1,000. That means if we have 10% or 1% or 10 dispensaries here in the city, we'd be looking at getting 1% of that 15%. And how that would hypothetically break out here would be is if marijuana is in fact a $1 billion industry, you'll see the excise tax collected there. And then between Laura's portion and the research allocation and we're estimating here about $2.5 million in implementation costs be pulled out. That's another number that has yet to be determined. I've seen a couple of different projections, but I haven't seen a definitive number on how much Laura intends to remove out of the equation just for the implementation portion. So as of right now in our hypothetical, we use about 2.5 million. That, with the clinical research, pulls about 22.5 million out. The amount remaining, you'll see here, then gets divvied up into the percentage categories. Transportation Fund, School Aid Fund, both get their 35. It's not contingent upon any participation or any borders or anything like that. Counties and municipalities, their 15% going into that pot to be divvied up, you'll see is 11,650,000. And so that 1% in this scenario, again, if we have 10 out of 1,000, that 1% ends up being about 116,000. So that's our hypothetical breakout. You can change any one of those numbers Marijuana may not be a $1 billion industry in the first year. It may be a $1.5 billion industry in the first year. But this is essentially how it breaks out through the formula. So generally speaking, the people that I talk to, they go back and forth on whether or not this is strictly a revenue issue or if they have other things that they consider. But you get kind of a sense of how it breaks down before it finally filters down through the individual communities. If there are 300 licenses issued across the state and we have 3 of them, we still end up with that number. There's a lot of unknowns at this point. All right, so I'm going to turn over at this point to Mr. Johnson. That's my first quick overview, and then we'll break out into some legislative portions. But I want to introduce Mr. Chris Johnson, General Counsel for the Michigan Municipal League. As I said earlier, there are eyes and ears in Lansing, and Mr. Johnson plays a big part of that.
Got to transfer all the technology here. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak tonight. One thing I want to make very clear is the fact that the Michigan Municipal League is not making any recommendations one way or the other to Berkley as to whether or not you should or should not have commercial establishments. The whole idea of this particular statute was to have local communities make the decision in the local community, and that's really where your starting point is today. So please do not misinterpret anything that I say as either being for or against the commercial recreational marijuana establishment. I'm learning more about recreational marijuana than I think I ever wanted to learn. It's just been part of my job now for the last, since September when they put it on the ballot, because even in September it was obvious that it was going to pass. The particular initiated law of 2018 went into effect in December of last year. So the law is in place and it is already there. According to the state constitution, it was 10 days after the election was certified. And one of the important things about this particular statute is the fact that it can only be amended by a 3/4 vote of the state legislature. I don't know if you've been up in Lansing lately, but they can't even agree whether it's Tuesday or Wednesday. So we're not getting a lot of good, feedback from the legislature in terms of actually going forward on a policy basis. I wanted to talk just briefly about individual possession. I'll use my daughter as an example. She voted for Proposal 1. So I asked her, why'd you vote for Proposal 1? And her answer was real simple. It was, I don't think somebody should be going to jail for having a small amount of marijuana in their possession. I think they should be able to smoke a dope and not, bother anybody. And you shouldn't be going to jail. I live on Main Street in my community. And then I said, well, what did you think about having a pot shop, on Main Street? I never thought about that. Well, you should have. But the thought never really occurred to people. So please separate out these two concepts. The individual possession and use of marijuana is totally separate from whether or not commercial establishments come in. And people get this all confused all the time. There we go. So, a person is allowed to possess, store, and possess not more than 12 ounces of marijuana or up to 12 plants at any one time on one's own premises if they're 21 years or older. One of the first questions is that for every person 21 years or older in the household, or is it just 12? And the answer is, I don't know. I really don't. It's going to take litigation probably And that takes a long time before a court finally decides whether it'll be 12 per person or 12 per household. So I don't have a definitive answer for you. And a lot of municipal attorneys are debating that right now. And we have people on both sides of that question. A person who's 21 years or older may give away or otherwise transfer without remuneration up to 2.5 ounces of marijuana, and as long as they're not advertising or promoting it to the public. So I've got this little piece of marijuana, and here, you can have it. I'm giving it to you. Of course, that also implies, well, but I'm going to sell you this little clicker, and that's $200. And come with that is this little bag of free marijuana. Laura, the organization we just checked with recently, or described recently, was saying that's an illegal transfer because we're not collecting the taxes. So I think that's going to result in some more litigation. And it took us about 8 years as we were working through the medical marijuana law to finally get to a point where we, understand what the rules are. A person who's 21 years or older may assist another person who is 21 years or older in any of the acts that I just described. And they may use, possess, or purchase marijuana accessories, or distribute or sell marijuana accessories to persons who are 21 years or older. So if you used to have ordinances that prohibited marijuana paraphernalia, those ordinances are no longer valid for persons that are 21 years and older. That doesn't mean 16-year-olds can possess it. That means 21 and older. Now, this is really the question we're here tonight to look at. And by the way, everything I was talking about with that individual possessing and using marijuana does not change with anything that the city council can do. That train left the station. It overwhelmingly passed. These are where your options are in terms of what you as a local community can do as it relates to recreational marijuana establishments. And as the city manager mentioned, we spell it this way because that's the way the drafters of the legislation drafted it. That's the way with the H, not with the J. And I'm a lawyer, and I follow the law. So I'm going to use the H version throughout this presentation. The Act actually creates 6 types of licenses for marijuana establishments. And depending on how you read the law, it might have even created a 7th version. So the first kind of license you can get, oops, I just turned this off. First kind of license you can get is a grower's license. And they've separated this into 3 classes. Class A for 100 plants, Class B for 500 plants, and Class C for 2,000 plants. And oh, by the way, these numbers are not consistent with the medical marijuana law. So we've got that whole problem and issue about reconciling these 2 laws and whether they'll work together or not. The second type of license you can get is a processor license. And those are the folks that extract the THC and the other items out of the marijuana so that you can create marijuana-infused products, i.e. the brownies or the candies or whatever else. Third kind of license that's given is a secure transporter license, which is kind of interesting because it's transporting the marijuana and the cash between facilities. This is kind of an interesting problem because secured transporter sort of implies armed guards and things, but the feds are real clear about taking away your federal license to carry a firearm if you're involved with the marijuana business. So I don't know how that's going to turn out after we get done with all the litigation. It's another one of those things that I just don't know. Whether the secure transporter is going to be in a different car behind the ban that's carrying marijuana? I don't know, but it's something to think about. The next kind of license that's going to be out there is a safety compliance facility. And that's going to test the various marijuana, the strengths, and whether it's a good product or a bad product based on the amounts of THC in the product. Finally, they've got a retailer license. And this is going to be selling marijuana or marijuana-infused products only to registered patients and caregivers. And this is a nice, interesting new license that's going to be available too, and that's a micro business. And that's a vertical license, where the same micro business is growing the plant, processing it, and then selling it out the door. And that's for up to 150 plants. And finally, and this is why I was saying maybe there's 7 under this act, which is any other type of marijuana-related businesses licensed by the state under the Medical Marijuana Act. So all these things are in Public Act number 1 initiated. Now, it's important to note that there can be no municipal regulation on the individual possession and use. So if City Council was thinking about that, stop thinking about that. This only applies to the regulation of commercial establishments. Unlike the Medical Marijuana Act, where the community has to specifically opt in, if you decide you don't want commercial establishments, you have to affirmatively opt out, which is kind of different and kind of a little where people are not understanding the difference, but it's opt in for medical and opt out for recreational. If you do nothing, the state will issue licenses once they have rules and regulations in place. If you're going to opt out, most municipal attorneys are saying do it by ordinance rather than resolution, because the act itself incorporates language that refers to ordinances. Again, whether you do or don't is up to your community. If the city or village council does not act to opt out, citizens have the right to petition or initiate an ordinance to provide for the number of marijuana establishments or to completely prohibit them. So, for example, the council decides not to opt out. Citizens have the right under this act to petition the council to form an ordinance that way. And that's an important concept under municipal law, because you don't necessarily get the right to initiate a ballot proposal on every little thing that comes around. This is a very important concept here too. The state has 1 year. So December of this year, 2019, they need to come up with rules and regulations. I've spoken significantly to Andrew Brisboe, who is we call him the marijuana czar back at the office, but he's a person that is the director of marijuana regulation for the state, and he works in the Lara department. And they are charged with doing this within 1 year. Now, they've spent several years going through medical marijuana laws and rules and regulations, and they're very convinced, at least I've been in various programs where he's at, where they think they're going to make that year, so that isn't going to be a problem. It's more likely that they're going to have a problem with Treasury, because they're going to have to roll out a taxing system on something that's prohibited by federal law. So again, how that all turns out, I don't know. But if once the state actually has their rules in place, that's when the city has to make their decision on opting in or opting out. That's the decision to make, because if you don't, you've opted in by definition. Again, Lara is really confident of making this 1 year deadline. And I've been assured by Mr. Brisboe on several occasions that they think they're going to make that. The medical marijuana process was something that took them a long time to do. And because it did take them a long time, they have a model in place, and they intend to use the same model in getting recreational rules in place. Here's another little thing that I was talking to a bunch of municipal attorneys about a week ago or so, and your local ordinances, if you have them, cannot be unreasonably impractical. Can you tell me what that means? I don't have a clue. I went to law school for 3 years, and I don't know what those two words mean put that way, but I think we're going to see a lot of litigation over it. I don't know if it was designed by design or not, but that's the kind of term that's just going to result in litigation. And you can establish reasonable restrictions on public signs related to such establishments. But oh, by the way, there's this United States Supreme Court case out there called Gilbert, Reed versus Town of Gilbert, that says you can't have any content-related restrictions on signs. So, I don't know how that's going to work. Are you sensing a theme here? Yeah, it's clear as mud. Now you can, under your ordinances, you can regulate the place, time, and manner of operation of establishments. But remember, they cannot be unreasonably impractical. May authorization of sale of marijuana for consumption in designated areas not accessible to persons for 21 years or older. And this could be in a public place if it's allowed specifically by the ordinance. You can reduce the size of your drug-free zones to less than 1,000 feet under this ordinance. And your violations of your local ordinance must be a civil infraction rather than misdemeanor, and they can't have more than a $500 fine. You may require local licensure to operate these kinds of facilities and establishments. And you may not charge more than an annual fee of $5,000 per license to defray the administrative and enforcement costs. So that's the money that's allowed under the statute for the local community. The city cannot restrict transportation of marijuana. Remember, we talked about individuals can possess and use, etc. Well, this also applies to the transportation of the commercial establishments once they're established. So if a community on the north and the south both have these kinds of facilities and there's a secure transporter, there is no authorization for Berkley to stop that. And you may not prohibit a grower, processor, or retailer from operating within a single facility that's also licensed under the Medical Marijuana Act. And how Laura actually interprets this, I don't know how they're going to do it yet. Those are rules that are yet to be written. If the number of applicants for licensure exceed the number of allowed establishments, you have to have a competitive process to select applicants. So you've decided locally you only want 10 kinds of establishments for growers, or 2 transporters, that sort of thing. Your ordinance needs to have a competitive process in there to select which 2 would get those licenses. It may cause a little more litigation. I do like the Lawyers Full Employment Act, by the way. And for the first 24 months of existence under the new rules, only Michigan residents may receive a Class A grower or micro-business license. That's going to be interesting because that would probably violate the federal Constitution. But I'm not sure somebody's going to bring a lawsuit in a federal court to enforce something that's against federal law anyway in the first place. I'm having fun with this. And only medical marijuana licensees can receive a Class B or Class C. Those were the higher numbers on the grower licenses, or serve as a secure transporter or have a retail license. So only Michigan residents, or excuse me, medical marijuana licenses can do that. So what are your choices under the ordinances? You can adopt or amend applicable ordinances, providing language that's up to date, that's consistent with the new act. And remember the unreasonable, impractical items there. You may amend the zoning code to define where the various types of businesses may be located. So that's a local choice for you. And you might be considering amending your local police powers code or your general code to make sure that the licensing process is consistent with the state of Michigan and the act itself. Some other problems that you might want to think about, but we don't have answers to yet. Marijuana businesses traffic and schedule on substances, and therefore can be heavily cash oriented. Banks will not accept businesses that are doing marijuana related businesses because the feds can come in and seize their assets. So it can't go to a bank. The state, through Laura, is going to attempt to create a system through Treasury that might act as something of a banking mechanism. They're hopeful that they can get that through in the next year as well, and that'll be part of their licensing scheme for collecting the taxes. Technically, I think the feds could still step in and take all that revenue and seize it as being an illegal activity under federal law. And as Congress looks around for money in various places, who knows? If you have dog sniffing or marijuana dogs in your local community, you may want to consider retiring those because it won't be probable cause to arrest a person for that anymore. How should the city determine who gets a license? And if so, what? Remember, you got to design a competitive process that will meet the intent of the law. And there are probably other health, safety, and welfare issues that we haven't thought about, but that's something you need to think about for your ordinance. Finally, this is probably not so well known in the Act, but employers can still keep their drug-free workplaces in place. There's a real important case in Michigan involving a medical marijuana user who was working for Walmart, and he had his medical marijuana card and it was prescribed and he was taking his medication, but Walmart had a drug-free policy. And the state of Michigan Supreme Court upheld his discharge because it violated the policy of Walmart. So this is something to think about. Who's your employer? What do they say about medical marijuana? What do they say about recreational marijuana? At our place, in our shop, we have, I'd have to take a drug test before I got hired, and if I had marijuana in my system, I was not going to get the job. And that's allowed to stand. So I don't know if you know who your employer is or what their policy is, but this act does not change that. Even though a person isn't going to violate the law, they might lose their job because they violated the policy. And all the immunities that are in the Medical Marijuana Act are still in place. i.e., if you have your medical marijuana card, you can't be convicted of a crime by using medical marijuana. A couple of things that the new act does not do. It doesn't allow the consumption of marijuana while you're operating motor vehicles, a plane, a boat, snowmobile, that sort of thing. And you can't be smoking marijuana in the compartment of the car either. So that's still a violation of state law. And landlords do have the right to prohibit the smoking of marijuana in their facilities. However, they may not prohibit the possession of the marijuana, nor can they have, say, consumables. If it's in a brownie or something along that line, they still have to permit that as well. They can only prevent the smoking of marijuana, much as they do tobacco use. We touched on this just a little bit earlier, but I wanted to make a couple of points. The answer really is we don't know how much money is going to be generated out of this and what our local share may or may not be. Section 14 of the Act sets up that distribution and specifically states that the state will be reimbursed first. Heard a very interesting question asked of Mr. Brisboe the other day, and that was, how many employees do you have? Any idea? 138 right now, before they get into the recreational stuff. So this law is going to support 138 folks working in that department right off the top. You do the math. And once again, it's going to be a cash business, so it's going to be harder to audit these businesses to say, did you put the proper 10% into the tax revenue that should go there? There's much less of an audit trail on doing that sort of thing. So I kind of wanted to close with this. There's a lot of money in this particular item, and that's one of the reasons why it was pushed so hard by the commercial establishments. The decision is yours, though, as a local community. So we're not telling you one way or the other which way to go. Just know what your options are. Who's next? I love technology.
A lot of really good information there from Mr. Johnson. The last portion of what he said is exactly what we're here to talk about today, is the choice is ours. And so, hence the large question in text there. I do have some of the earliest questions coming right now. I just got handed to me. Keep the blue cards coming, please. If any part of what we presented so far has inspired a question, if there's something left unanswered still at this point for you, please go ahead and submit the blue card. Again, the reason we want these in writing, so if there's something that we can't answer tonight, that way we still have the question so that we can get it answered eventually. As you saw from Mr. Johnson's presentation, there's still a lot, the answer to a lot of these questions still, unfortunately, is just, we don't know. Whether it hasn't been litigated, whether we haven't heard from the state yet, but they're coming though. They're working on it, as Ms. Johnson said. The state believes that they have a framework in place under the licensing of the medical marijuana that would help them at least get a jump start on the recreational portion. So I am going to try to tackle a couple of these questions so far, or at least have them in your mind as we go through the next portion of this. First one is, does the city have the right to include child-resistant packaging requirements for edibles? It's a good question. I assume the answer is still I don't know. Will the city establish potency limits? Will the ordinance require specific distances from schools? What provisions are in place to control problems such as mold, offensive odors, fire? Second portion, will the city implement controls to prevent or minimize these concerns? Fifth one, I'm concerned about the youth. Will edibles be banned in the city? And sixth one is, how much will the city get and who gets their share first? So these are some of the questions we've gotten so far. Please do keep them coming as we go through here. If any of these inspired a question of your own, or again, if any portions of the presentation inspired a question, please do your best. Just keep them coming. However, we'll capture them on the blue cards there for you. All right. So what we talk about, a timely decision is key. As you heard Mr. Johnson say, there's not a huge rush. The state does have a year, but we do know that they're going to get there. And so we need to have the local decision, basically the local decision whether it's a decision to put our own rules on it, a decision just to say yes, or a decision just to say no. We need to have it done at least before these facilities become licensed, because we're automatic subject to the state's framework then. So again, we have a couple of different options in front of us, and this is sort of a quick version of the span here. Is it nothing, yes with limits, or opt out completely? Quickly running through those. The do nothing option. So basically we take no action on this. Again, by the action of not opting out is by law opting in here. And so marijuana establishments of all types would be permitted in the city as long as they go through the state's licensing. Existing local ordinances for other commercial businesses will apply. Again, if it's a retail facility, they wouldn't be allowed in an office area, but they would be allowed in any of the zoning districts that currently allow retail establishments. And the state rules and regulations will apply there. And as soon as they figure out what those are. So option two is some of the things that Mr. Johnson alluded to earlier. We do have some leeway here at a local level. So we can establish limits on the business types, whether we'll only allow the retail, we'll only allow grow, only allow transportation locations, and then also we have the option of putting a limit on this as well. How many of those will we allow here in the city of Berkeley? Again, and then we'll also have to amend new zoning rules. So if we don't want them, say we allow retail, but we don't want them to allow it in any of the locations we currently have retail for, we can take the step of limiting those further into very specific zoning districts or very specific portions of the city. One of the things I would like each and every person to do before they leave here tonight is we have little sticky dots and we have a map of the city. If you have a strong feeling about where you think this is most appropriate or where you would like to see these types of facilities limited to, just do us a favor, grab a dot, stick it to the map wherever you think is most appropriate, or if you think there's 2 or 3 places that are most appropriate. But please do so. That's going to help us refine what our next steps look like here. Again, local zoning and related ordinances must be adopted before the state rules are issued. That's if we're going to have full control of this versus the state just having the full control there. Option 3 is to opt out, and it's a full opt out. It's basically saying that we're not going to allow the recreational marijuana establishments here in the city. Again, as Mr. Johnson said, possession, medical marijuana use, none of that's affected at all. It's simply this is saying that only the recreational commercial marijuana is not allowed in the city. Again, we would need those in place as well prior to the state issuing licenses. Some of the other considerations, as Mr. Johnson alluded to as well, some of the things that are known unknowns, the public safety impacts. Will additional staffing, funding, and other resources be required? Some of the locations, the proximity comes into play. Most of the conversation leading up to the vote in November was do we regulate this much as the same way as we do with alcohol, which does have prohibition with basically thresholds, distance thresholds from schools and churches. And then response to violations. These have to be civil infractions. In the city of Berkeley specifically, we would need additional legislation for that. Most of the violations of our local ordinances are currently misdemeanors, criminal offense. This is the effect of this vote decriminalized it, meaning that we would have to put it specifically in local ordinance in place that makes that a civil infraction, and then decide what the fines are for that as well. As we move forward, from a process standpoint, we would need if we move forward with this, if the city would allow these licenses to be done, as you heard, we need to have a process in place. There are a couple of buzzwords in that legislation that we need to adhere to. We can't be unreasonably impractical. As soon as that terminology gets litigated, we need to make sure that we have a process that's also, as you saw, competitive as well. And so that if we do have a rush, at least initially, of licenses, we need to have a defensible way of selecting who receives that license. Otherwise, we're opening ourselves up to some sort of litigation as well. And then the classic government bureaucracy, application and fees. How are we gonna assess that as well? And then in order to make that competitive, in order to give us a defensible process, we need to know what information that we need to get from the applicants. All doable, all within the city's abilities to do. We just perhaps would need some time in place to get that done. Yet more considerations. Business types. Are we really going to go for? Are we going to allow all 6 or possibly 7 types of facilities here in the city? Do we want to have a conversation about retail? Do we just want to have a conversation about growers? Do we just want to have a conversation about the production of recreational marijuana? These are some of the questions as well. And then going back to how many and where, and then again, our unknown unknowns, which again, we're hoping that the state's working on. It's just going to take some time. And then the questions yet unanswered by the time the state's regulations come out will end up getting litigated, and then we'll get some additional clarifications as well. So it takes us to the next steps. We got to figure out what option to pursue. And again, we're going to lean heavily on your opinion and on those that have taken the online surveys as well. So please, again, I'm going to put another plug in for the yellow survey sheets. If you haven't had a chance to fill yours out yet, please don't leave here without having done so and giving them to the handsome gentleman, Jay Grossman, over there, who is collecting those, or any of the staff members that you know that you can hand them to. We just want to make sure you don't leave with one, without having filled it out. And if you don't feel like, if you want to mull it over, if you want to consider it a little bit further, feel free to take the online survey. It's going to be open through February 26th. And so that, if you don't feel like you've got enough information, if you want to do some additional research, we don't want to rush you. We want to make sure you have yet another week to get that done. And then, as we talked about, if we're moving forward with this, we need to figure out what form that takes for our city. And in our city, we would need to start almost immediately to ramp up, to go through public hearings, go through zoning updates, go through a process of selecting an administrative flow for how we're going to get this done. And then finally, some of those questions as well. So again, I've got the six here. If this isn't one of your questions, or if this inspires you further, then please feel free to fill out the yellow cards and hand us over to us. So thank you so much, sir. Appreciate that. Thank you for you guys as well. So I'm going to try to answer some of these on the fly. I may depend on Mr. Johnson. I may depend on City Attorney John Starron's also here as well. I hope I don't have to default to we're not sure yet, but it's likely. So the first one is, what about medical marijuana in Berkley? Medical first, ? Or just directly to adult use / recreational. So the city council has decided that we did opt out of the medical marijuana licensing, and so we haven't really had a conversation about it up to this. We are, for the purposes of this meeting and our online survey, right now focusing on the recreational portion of it. A lot of questions here, and I appreciate the input, and whoever turned this in has exceptional handwriting, which I appreciate greatly. What can we learn from other states that have already legalized recreational marijuana? It's a good question, and I think the state is utilizing some of that framework now. I know I have seen presentations that were leaning for and leaning against. I've seen some on the crime and some of the issues that have gone along with it. I've seen some on the revenue surpluses that some of the states have seen. So, I think the individual who puts together the presentation's intent plays a big role into what information is presented, but several other states have taken this step before we have, and thank you. Several other states have taken this step before we have, and so there is a framework there that we can depend on. Are surrounding communities opting in? If so, who? I can't give you a complete list off the top of my head. I do know that the city of Ferndale, city of Hazel Park have both indicated that they will be an opt-in community. The city of Walled Lake, I read an article in the Free Press the other day talking about them being an opt-in community. They've already got what they hope is their first licensed facility.
Laura maintains a website of all the communities that have opted out.
Thank you. City Attorney John Starron just updated me that Laura is maintaining a website that have all the cities that have opted in and out. No.
By definition,
Please, sir.
By definition, you are opting out is your only choice.
Okay.
You are in unless you opt out.
Gotcha.
So the list is
Okay.
only for the opt-out
I
community.
appreciate the clarification. Thank you. So that's LARA. For those looking for it, just search LARA-Michigan, and it should take you right to the website. I'm going to jump to the updated sheet that I've been handed as well. Is Laura ready to grant license before December? Question mark. Do cities need to opt out before then? Generally speaking, we need to have some decisions made, whether it's the opt out or whether it's the local restrictions that we want to put in place, or whether it's just a full-on yes prior to the state issuing licenses. Have you considered the effect of the 4 drug rehab centers in our immediate area? There are 3 in Berkley. I'd say it's a big part of the conversation here, and what effect the 2 can have. With all the cash driving around in Berkley, will they be same or less gas stations, liquor stores, and similar businesses? That is one of those known unknowns. We're not sure exactly how that would go. And the last one here, then we'll break into our different information stations. There are banks accepting cannabis deposits in Illinois and every state. If a business doesn't have a bank now, is there a federal bill addressing this? I'm getting a nod. I'm getting a nod from both the attorneys here. So the feds are not looking to make any carve-out exceptions for those states that have It's still in committee form, though. Okay. So nothing that's reached the House floor yet. Yes. Yeah, but I don't know if they're federally licensed or not. So that's one of those ones that we can follow up here as well.
State banks, they're not
Okay. So that's one of those ones. That's the great part about getting these from you guys in hand, is we can get well-researched answers out to the community in response to these. So those are the ones we've had. I've got a couple in hand as well that I'd like to get answered for you guys. But I do want to break into some of the stations as well. No, you're trying to get capture everything I can in writing so far. I want to, yeah, I want to try to get in writing from you guys so we can get all this stuff put out to the community later. All right, and that's it. So again, our information stations, Mr. Johnson will be available, I'll be available. Please don't leave without submitting the question cards. Please don't leave without getting the surveys done and voting on the sort of your dot survey on the zoning areas as well. So we can't wait to have some of these conversations with you guys one-on-one. Okay, thank you.